in the 1970s, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act was signed by President Carter. It was introduced by Senator Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts. And the goal of the law was to provide some oversight, both congressional and judicial, over the intelligence community, so-called surveillance capabilities, directed as they were outward, outside of the United States. And the law did, among other things, something important, which was to say presidents cannot order surveillance. They cannot order surveillance of American citizens or people inside the United States. That has to, if the executive branch wants to conduct such surveillance, it has to go through the Department of Justice, and those prosecutors have to apply for either court orders or warrants, through the typical criminal process in a regular criminal court, or in the foreign intelligence context, to the FISC court, the special secret court. So that's all well and good. Then 9/11 happens, right? And for those of you who don't remember, we learned in 2005, thanks to a James Risen story in the New York Times, that ever since 9/11, the Bush administration had instructed the NSA that it was now free to conduct warrantless wiretapping operations of Americans, even without those FISC orders, without those individualized FISC orders, as long as one end of the communication is outside of the United States. So, in other words, if you call your friend in France or email your friend in Kenya, that communication under the Bush warrantless wiretapping program was seized by the NSA and maybe analyzed and maybe used against you in some way. So that was 2005. Side note, the New York Times' James Risen actually knew about the warrantless wiretapping program before the 2004 election. Obviously, in that election, George W. Bush beat John Kerry and was reelected for his second term as U.S. president. The New York Times sat on that warrantless wiretapping revelation until after the election, when James Risen informed his editors at the Times that he was going to publish the revelation in his book, at which point the Times caved and allowed the publication of that secret to proceed. So anyway, 3 years later, in 2008, one of the last things that President Barack Obama did as a senator, Democratic senator from Illinois, was to vote in favor of a law called the FISA Amendments Act. So the long version of that is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act Amendments Act of 2008. This law amended the 1978 Ted Kennedy, Jimmy Carter law that was to put handcuffs on the intelligence agencies, and effectively it removed those handcuffs in a couple of really crucial ways. One of them was to put Congress's stamp of approval on Bush's warrantless wiretapping program, which, when exposed in 2005, caused incredible controversy and received condemnation from people on the left, from the ACLU, as well as from conservatives, including Bill Kristol, who was horrified that the program existed. So Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act of 2008, which, again, Obama voted for as one of his last acts as a senator, that President Bush signed into law as one of his last acts as president. Section 702 of that law effectively put Congress's stamp of approval on the Bush warrantless wiretapping program. So under Section 702, U.S. persons, which is to say people physically inside the United States, and U.S. citizens cannot be targeted by the NSA for warrantless surveillance. They can, however, see their communications collected, retained, analyzed, and even used against them in criminal investigations and prosecutions in the United States, as long as they were not the target of the surveillance. So a simple way of describing what that means is that, Alexis, say I call my friend in France. My friend in France is a target of NSA surveillance. the conversation that I have with that friend is therefore collected by the NSA through one of its 702 collection programs. Even though I wasn't the target, quote unquote, of that surveillance, it doesn't matter because the result is essentially the same. The NSA can use that information against me, and even worse, the FBI can use that information against me.
So can I ask you a question about it?
Yeah.
So if the law says they can't target a U.S. citizen, but if my communications are collected because they're investigating someone else, couldn't they just target me by targeting a friend of mine who happens to be overseas? Or is
they're not supposed to. Yes, that's in the statute. What you just described is called reverse targeting, and it's illegal. They are not supposed to do that. Now, really important question becomes, how do we know that they're not doing that? How would one ever prove that that was not done? It sort of goes to intent, right? You would have to prove that in order to challenge just on a statutory ground that your communications were unlawfully targeted through this kind of reverse targeting procedure under Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act, you'd have to show the court a lot of facts that probably no one is going to be able to show, including that your communications were collected under Section 702 authorities, that the collection was meant to target your communications and not your communications partners. And so I think, it's going to be very difficult for anyone to ever be able to do that. Another reason why the reverse targeting, the ban on reverse targeting is kind of meaningless is because they're allowed to retain those communications, right? So you would think that if they really wanted to prevent Americans' communications from being swept up in this warrantless wiretapping scheme, that they would actually go through and erase information that they know originates or lands in the United States. And they don't do that. In fact, in public statements, members of the quote unquote intelligence community have said that they actually think that those American communications are what they're really after, that those are some of the most important communications that are collected under Section 702, belying the claim that they don't target Americans. The purpose of the statute is to be able to authorize the warrantless surveillance of Americans' international communications. So I just want to say one more thing about this terrible statute, which is that in 2011, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which under Section 702 is not required to issue individualized court orders for this type of surveillance. In other words, Section 702 gives the NSA broad authority to conduct this kind of surveillance without going to the court. The NSA is, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, who's the top intelligence official in the United States government, is, on the other hand, required to go to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court when they want to make substantial modifications to the regulations or the rules that they use to process or handle or share the information that they collect under these authorities. And in 2011, they obtained approval from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to start conducting what are called backdoor searches on the data that they've collected on Americans through this Section 702 authority. And what that means is that now, since 2011, NSA analysts as well as FBI officers across the country who have access to this database can actually search for your name or your phone number or your email address or IP address in this huge database that they've collected, supposedly not targeting Americans, but incidentally collecting tons of Americans' communications. They can actually search for your name, phone number, whatever identifier in that database, and review and use in any way that they want the information that is returned. So say, somebody you communicate with on a regular basis, lives outside the United States. Therefore, all of your communications with that person are hoovered up and stored in this database. The FBI, even before it opens a full investigation into you, when it's just looking into you on the basis of what's called an assessment, which is a level of investigation that requires no criminal predicate. So I'm just going to say this in the simplest way possible. An FBI agent who does not suspect that you are involved in criminal activity, but wants to find out if maybe you are, can search for your name in this massive database of warrantlessly wiretapped Americans' communications. And then if he finds evidence of illegality, even if it's just a violation of domestic law, criminal law, having nothing to do with foreign intelligence, any foreign power, or terrorism, he can use that information not only to initiate an investigation into you, but also ultimately in court against you. So it's incredibly unconstitutional. I mean, it's just obviously illegal. Unfortunately,
that's crazy. Have you guys sued them over this? I assume you have.
Yes. So the day actually that the law was signed in 2008, the FISA Amendments Act was signed, the ACLU filed suit alleging that Section 702 is unconstitutional. And in 2013, February of 2013, just a month after the Obama administration had successfully pushed for the reauthorization of that statute through December 2017, in February 2013, just a month after this reauthorization that was hard fought and won by Barack Obama, constitutional law professor in chief, the Supreme Court ruled in the ACLU lawsuit called Amnesty v. Clapper that our clients, among them human rights lawyers, Amnesty International employees, did not have what's called standing to challenge the statute. So we didn't even get to the constitutional question whether or not the statute was acceptable under the Fourth Amendment or the First Amendment. We were stopped at the standing bar, which means the DOJ had argued to the government, these people can't prove that their communications were obtained through Section 702 and through those authorities, rather, that are granted through Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act. And therefore, they don't have a right to challenge the constitutionality of the statute because they can't prove that it impacts them.
That's crazy. So they're like, we have the information, you don't have the information. And since you don't have the information about whether or not we're spying on you, you can't prove that we're spying on you. And therefore, you don't have standing to sue.